My name is Michael Hughes. I work with Professor Graff in the library, and I want to welcome you to a talk that I call Fan and Aca-Fan, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love My Hobbies. Now, since joining Trinity in 2012, it has been my pleasure, and occasionally my pain, to instrumentalize my hobbies. That is, to merge my avocation, video games, with my vocation, specifically those scholarly obligations that I have as a member of Trinity's faculty. I've written about the adoption of gamification techniques by academic libraries and about the players who devote untold hours of their lives to writing walkthroughs of their favorite games. Recently, I wrote about the brief but electric career of a pioneering video game critic, a cartoonist named John Holmstrom. Now, today I want to talk about why someone might want to do work of this kind and about the uses of such work. I also want to talk about some of the risks of so-called Aca-fandom, the perils of tunnel vision, of thinking and writing about subjects that one finds deeply pleasurable. First, we need to get clear on a couple definitions. Everyone listening to this talk could probably produce a good working definition of fan, academic, but for our purposes today, I really want to zero in on the ways that fans and academics are defined by their information behaviors. That is, their participation in certain social processes, their seeking and use of information in particular. I am also interested in examining the resulting effects of those processes on the kinds of work that fans and academics produce. So let's start with fans. Here's how the Oxford English Dictionary defines the word. A fanatic, a keen and regular spectator of a professional sport, a keen follower, and so forth. Note the pejorative origin. That's all but forgotten as fandoms have swallowed the world. We now use that word colloquially as a synonym for enthusiast. Perhaps you would describe yourself as a fan of a band or a sports team or so forth. In this talk, I'm particularly interested in capital F fans, mega fans, the kinds of people who exhibit a greater than usual devotion to their object of interest. True fans, as a member of fandom might say, the implication being that casual fandom is something of an oxymoron. What are some examples of things that true fans do? I hope that you'll bring a few examples of your own to class when we meet together. For now, here's an example of fan work that gets at the level of devotion that I have in mind. You are looking at a mountain range, but in particular, you're looking at, in this boxed in portion, a blurry image of that mountain range. What you're looking at is a texture, that is a graphical skin, which was originally laid atop a three-dimensional model to give it the appearance of a mountain range. That texture is drawn from a video game called Super Mario 64. And someone went to the great trouble to figure out that that texture came from this place. This is Sennin Pond in Miyoko, which is found in Niigata Prefecture in Japan. The question is, who would go to such trouble? Why does it matter that we know where these textures came from? Well, it matters a lot to these folks. This is a community called Render 96, and they have made it their mission to locate the origins of all of the image assets, all of the sound assets that went into the creation of this game, to scour these stock photo libraries in order to find these original images. As you can see in the description here, that's really the point, right? Creation, that is making something new with these images, that's actually of secondary importance. Finding the original asset is a means unto itself. The joy is in the hunt. And yet, I think many of us watching a video clip like this would be left scratching our heads. So it's an incredible amount of sleuthing to a purpose that is by no means certain or obvious. In fact, watching this, you might, like me, think, God, only if you paid me, right? This seems like the height of tedium. And yet these people are quite serious about their work, obviously. And what's more, they have an audience. Like this clip has 14,000 views. The channel has 6,700 subscribers. Okay, these numbers are kind of small potatoes by the standards of YouTube's most popular and influential creators, but I think you would agree with me that that's a large and appreciative audience given the niche appeal of this content, right? And yet, nevertheless. So let me attempt to answer that question I posed a moment ago. Why would somebody undertake work of this kind? What are the motivations that drive it and the gratifications that attend on it? Here are just a few. I think sociability is chief among them, right? This is a community. It's a community of people who do this work. And you get the benefits of community that come from that, a sense of friendship and so forth. Pleasure, obviously. Curiosity about where these assets come from in the game. You know, creativity and self-expression is a part of this, I think. And then maybe to a lesser extent, you get some motivations like these two, status and altruism. It's not impossible that people in this community who are particularly good at this kind of detective work enjoy status, higher status relative to others. You know, newer members of the community, for example. In many cases, fans act out of a sense of altruism, a helping motivation. They want to help one another with their shared projects. To what end, though? To what end? Well, I think it's to prolong and maximize the love that one has for a given object, right? It just can't quite give it up. It's not enough to play the game once, twice, or even 10 times. Now we have to just like explore it down to the atomic and subatomic level, right? So these are folks who are seeking an ever deeper knowledge, really an intimacy of that object, to understand it better than anyone else possibly could, and then to have that same love reciprocated by like-minded others. This satisfies that deep need for belonging that we all have. Notice also that this is a closed system. Okay, now my closed system, I don't mean that the community is private or inaccessible. I mean that in subcultures, members are accountable to one another, to the extent that they're accountable at all, right? And so what I mean is they do this work, work that you and I may stumble across and we may even enjoy, right? But it's not made for us. And so fans are sensitive to critiques that come from other fans, and they may be completely impervious or uninterested to critiques that come from outside the system, right? So there's no public obligation. Now let's contrast that with this other person, the academic, right? So an academic is a member of a university's teaching or research staff, but really here I'm thinking about this other part of the definition. It's someone who's interested in or excelling at pursuits involving reading, thinking, and study, okay? So you're all familiar with the kinds of work that academics do. You're reading plenty of that work in this very class. And we don't have to rehearse all those motivations because there's a great degree of overlap with fans. But to the aspects that we examined a moment ago, I will add two: security and animus. Security might be best summed up as publish or perish, right? Academics are expected to do this work, and if they don't, there's especially in the pre-tenure stage, there's a real chance that they may not get to carry on and continue in their work. So doing the work, really, your job may depend on it. And then animus also shouldn't be underestimated as a driving factor, as a motivator for doing certain kinds of scholarship. And I think this is best summed up by a philosopher of science named David Hull, who once said, "Scientists acknowledge that among their motivations are natural curiosity, the love of truth, and the desire to help humanity. But other inducements exist as well, and one of them is to get that son of a bitch." So what he's getting at is probably best summed up by this famous XKCD cartoon. You just can't stand it when someone in your discipline has said something that you deeply, deeply disagree with. To what end? Here we have some pretty significant differences to the ends of fan work, right? It's not enough just to collect items as in a scavenger hunt, like our friends from Render 96. The academic is interested in taking that information and using it to seek the truth. I would submit that that's probably the objective in its most reducible form, to discover and disseminate knowledge that describes the world and its contents as they really are, to advance human understanding. This is not a closed system. Again, in contrast with the fans, this is an open system, meaning here academics must submit their work for public inspection, not just inspection from like the lay public, but from other people in their discipline who have a special incentive and maybe even a special responsibility to test the claims the other academics in their areas are making about the world, right? Critically here, there's no special authority. So again, in fandom, you might be able to invoke certain identity authorities in order to say what kinds of discourse are acceptable. No such authority obtains in academe. We're only interested in the kind of disinterested and dispassionate search for what is true. And so this is a conversation that never really ends. Knowledge is always subject to this kind of testing and confirmation process. That's how we come to rely on it as knowledge. So what would happen if we took these two specimens that we've just anatomized and talked about a little bit? If we took the fan and the academic and put them together, well, you'd get this person. You'd get the Aca-Fan and all his tweedy, nerdy glory. The scholar who coined this term, Jason Middle, defines Aca-Fan as a hybrid of academic and fan critics that acknowledges and interweaves both intellectual and emotional cultural engagements. When it comes to the motivations and gratifications of Aca-Fan research, again, we're looking at quite a bit of overlap. In fact, I would submit that the motivations and gratifications are more or less the same as to the straight up academic. What's different here is really the degree of ardor for one subject. It's unusually intense after the manner of a fan, right? But in every other respect, the work is the same and it has the same kinds of expectations, and the writer has certain obligations to send her work forward for inspection, for peer review, right? Again, what's different here is just that the object of love, emphasis on that word, there's a particular degree of devotion there, right? So let's talk about a particular example of Aca-Fan research. These are soda machines, as depicted in the video game Animal Crossing. And this image comes from a project on the internet called the Video Game Soda Machine Project. The Video Game Soda Machine Project is an obsessive catalog of soda vending machines as depicted in video games. This is maintained by Jess Morissette, a professor of political science at Marshall University. The project surpassed 3,300, that's right, 3,300 unique entries in 2020. So that's 3,300 different depictions of soda machines in video games. The Soda Machine Project demonstrates the movement here from one category to another. That is, from the mere sort of finding of stuff and the exultation in the mere finding, akin to our Mario 64 modders, to another kind of work altogether, a work that's more interested in the whys and wherefores. It's more interested in understanding, that has a certain degree of depth to it, right? So what began as a distinctively fannish enterprise to just obsessively catalog video game pop culture, and the pun is Morissette's, eventually became a serious peer-reviewed study about what all these soda machines might mean. What kinds of meaning are they conveying? Well, Jess Morissette actually tried to answer that question in an article for Game Studies, a peer-reviewed journal. Zero in on this part of the abstract in particular, and look at the kinds of questions that he's asking. These are sense-making questions, right? Here, Dr. Morissette is attempting to understand what these things signify or reify. What are the deeper meanings they might have or communicate? uh, possibly they aren't just soda machines at all. A typical player, I think, would say, pish posh, you're overthinking it. A soda machine is a soda machine is a soda machine. But overthinking is kind of what academics do, right? And not everyone is given to such deep and prolonged study. But tracing these patterns of origin and association, explaining submerged significations, excavating that meaning, even in seemingly trivial media objects. This is the work, right, that is sort of typical of an Aca-Fan, or to unpack all of those assumptions and ideologies that might uh, linger sort of just out of view. So what does Morissette discover from all this hard thinking about soda machines? Well, two things. First, he discovers that taken together, the multiple purposes that soda machines have create something that is called presence. It's a critical goal of game development. You might think of it as immersion. It gives us a sense of really being there, really being in this virtual world, and sort of sublimating ourselves to that. And that's critical to that psychological state called flow, when you're really engaged with an object of attention, and you're kind of working at the limit of your abilities. And that's a critical part of what makes gameplay so much fun. So creating environments that feel real to us, that seem real, that we can interact with. You could go up to a soda machine in a video game and you could press it and it would give you a soda. And then maybe that soda has other benefits, right? Maybe it gives you a power up. Maybe, as in this screenshot, it just provides environmental illumination. It gives you a brief spot of respite in a really scary game, for example, where there's not much light and things are jumping out at you from the shadows. So they have these ludic elements to them. Sometimes they work in storytelling ways, really strange ways. I've never played this game, but okay, apparently a soda machine was a vessel for ghostly possession among all the other things that they could do. But Morissette goes a little further than that even. It's not just that soda machines have these kind of practical uses. They have a certain meaning, at least according to him, right? They encode values, in this case, the values of contemporary capitalism. He argues that soda machines exemplify consumerism, advertising, brand affinity. He goes on, right? He says soda machines represent the excesses of neoliberalism by commodifying carbonated sugar water, a concoction with negligible intrinsic value, and marketing it to thirsty consumers. And that this too creates a kind of presence, although one that he's clearly very critical of, right? Game environments are real only in as much as they reproduce the same signifiers of neoliberalism that surround gamers on a daily basis. So shorter Morissette, even in virtual worlds, we can't imagine an economic system other than capitalism. So, you can find that argument persuasive or not. That's not really the point I'm driving at. It's just that this is the kind of work that an Aca-Fan might do. This is the level of scrutiny that he or she applies to seemingly mundane, seemingly trivial texts of popular culture, right? So we return to a very important question here. What problems attend on this work, apart from garden variety errors and human biases and so forth? Is there a problem with Aca-Fandom? Well, according to at least one scholar, yes, academic fandom is something to be resisted. Ian Bogost is a professor of computer science at Washington University in St. Louis. And he wrote a much discussed essay called Against Aca-Fandom. And what he argues in that essay is this, that scholars have a special obligation to explain something new about the works they discuss. It isn't enough just to sort of hold them up as good or bad, that one needs to train skepticism on them. He argues that the scholarly role is fundamentally one of skepticism, not celebration, right? As media scholars, we ought to have self-doubt about the quality and benefit of the work we study. We ought to perform that hesitance often and in public in order to weave a more complex web around media, not just to praise or blame particular works. So Bogost might say that a lack of skepticism could damage one's claims about pop culture by making them specious, or it could lead one to make tendentious claims about a text that it can't really support out of this surfeit of love for the text or defensiveness or both. What would happen if this kind of credulousness were extrapolated to an entire academic discipline? Well, something like this, perhaps. This, I think, seems to be underneath Bogost's concern. The risk that academia's conflict settling and truth discovering mechanisms could be harmed, right? What the science fiction writer David Brin calls disputation arenas, right? So we talked about this a moment ago. These are those places where scholars pit their ideas against one another, test claims and evidence, check for logical soundness, and generally do the work of making knowledge reliable. And we might say that love has nothing to do with it. It's just whether something is actually confirmable, falsifiable or not, whether the argument is persuasive. But Bogost might have us consider editors at a journal like Slayage, the International Journal of Buffy, which is indeed a real academic journal. Is it possible that those editors may have blind spots about Buffy the Vampire Slayer that the uninitiated would not? Is it possible? Perhaps the danger comes from the other direction, actually, that in an effort to overcompensate and to be extra critical of work in order to counter favoritism, work receives sort of an undue or harsh skepticism, right? Again, I think these are the things that Bogost is really concerned about. And so he continues that, embracing Aca-fandom is a bad idea, not because it's immoral or crude, but because it's too great a temptation. He says that pop culture scholars should remain dissatisfied with their texts, right? Not only, we have to challenge not only ourselves and our colleagues and our students, but also the public and creators of our chosen media. We ought not to be satisfied. That's the price of getting to make a living studying television or video games or even Shakespeare. So none of this is to suggest that Bogost's view is unimpeachable or correct. Indeed, his claims are subject to public checking as any other consequential proposition. Nor does it suggest that the study of popular culture is trivial. I suspect Dr. Bogost would agree with the sentiments expressed here. First, by the Department of Popular Culture at Bowling Green State University, the largest and most well-renowned institution of its kind. And then a really nice, short, snappy version from NPR's pop culture reporter, Linda Holmes. I love the way that she's phrased this here. If you wanted to understand monkeys and be of use to them, you would not only want to understand what monkeys ideally eat, but what they actually eat, how it affects them, and why they do it. So the problems with Aca-fandom are, I think, primarily of a technical, procedural nature. I think that they can be rectified through the writing of really good policies, for example. Or in my case, I make it a habit to always give my work to someone outside of my fan communities, whether that's Professor Graff or my wife or someone who just really couldn't care less about video games. I want to make sure that what I'm saying is persuasive to them, most of all, because I'm interested in having my stuff read as widely as possible, not just in the communities of which I'm part. So I think that these things are fixable. Now, the work that Aca-fans do may be impactful or not, may be good or not, but it is work that's worth doing, even if those reasons are just limited to the most sort of practical career-oriented concerns. So I think that there's something sort of obviously valuable or at least defensible, let's say, about Aca-fan work. But where does that leave fans? Can you build a life of meaning around your hobbies, around subjects of fannish devotion? Consider the dozens of fans who constitute the Render 96 community, who devote hours of their lives to tracking down the origins of graphical assets from their favorite video games, or the authors of fan fiction, whose works sometimes run past the length of tome-like novels such as War and Peace. Do these activities contribute meaning to life? Who are we to judge? Can we even say? Here are some questions I'd like you to answer before coming to class on Monday. First, are you a fan? Of what? And how would you rate the intensity of your interest? What role do your hobbies play in constructing a meaningful life? What does it mean to lead a meaningful life anyway? Can fandom supply that meaning in whole or in part? What are your requirements for meaningfulness? That is, what attributes should fan work have in order to qualify as meaningful? And is there some theoretical point at which work would stop being meaningful? So I'd like you to take some time to really address these questions, write out your thoughts and bring them with you, and take note of any other questions you have that may have come to mind while you were watching this presentation.